Okay, today we are in Sim Kuf Dalet Sif Gimel, and our topic is bugs are Nosein Lifgam. Now, in Yerdei Sim Kuf Gimel, it told us about the halacha of Nosein Lifgam, and from there it branched out to talk about a very common example of that, which is Ein Ben Yomai. And now we're in Sim Kuf Dalet, which continues with this Nosein Lifgam idea. So the first halachas, we're in Halacha Gimel. The first two were about a very specific bunch of cases that the Gemara talks about, having to do with an achbar, a rodent that falls into food, and which combinations of rodents and foods is Nosein Lifgam. Not so relevant for us. We once talked about a little bit of it, but not so relevant for us. Then, when the Gemara is in the middle of that discussion about different types of achbars that there are, it says that there's one which is the one which is Nosein Lifgam is revolting, and something that people would stay away from. The Gemara's words are mimis mois ubedil in shemine. And the Gemara, in contrast, says there's a different one that's like a delicacy. But the one that it describes as being Nosein Lifgam, that's how it describes mimis mois ubedil in shemine. So the Rashba seems to have picked up on the way the Gemara talks about this Nosein Lifgam, the way this description of mimis mois ubedil in shemine, and he says we could use that description to decide all kinds of other creatures that are Nosein Lifgam. In one place, he says all shratzim are Nosein Lifgam. In another place, his examples are zevuvim, nemalim, and yitushim, are what we say that they're flies, ants, and mosquitoes. And all these things, he uses Kamat the Gemara's words. He says dvarim hamusim shenefesh adam katzmehem, and or shekal adam boydem hem liusan. Okay, which is they're automatically Nosein Lifgam, which is and therefore because of Nosein Lifgam, if their time gets mixed into something, the food does not become asur. Okay, so that's the Rashbas will say like an extension or an understanding of the Gemara, and that's what's brought in our din halacha gimel. It's also in Siman Kuf Zayin and halacha beis over there. So the Shach, that's what the Rashba says, and that's what the Mechaber brings. The Shach brings many who argue on that, and they say that if you want to decide if something is Nosein Lifgam, does it give a negative taste into food or not, then the only way to do that is to either taste the food or taste if it gets mixed into food, seeing what it tastes like there, what kind of effect it have on that other food to decide if it was Nosein Lifgam. The fact that people would be revolted by eating a fly or some other insect has nothing to do with the time that they give, whether it's positive or negative. That's what the Shach says. Let's search the Shach for a second. The Shach says you should be machmir. He said you only can be makel in case of hefsid meruba or shasatah. So if we go on to what we think is the din of that case, what will the Shach do with this Gemara? The Gemara says that it's mimis mois ubedil in shemine. So what's wrong with what the Rashba says about that? So to answer that, you have to look more carefully at the Gemara. The Gemara, that line that I told you is really a part of a longer statement. It's like this: Amnur sheshes, but Amnur Rav Nosein Lifgam mutter. Really, Rav hold Nosein Lifgam is mutter. V'hacha chidushu. That was the quote we had from before. The Torah answered it anyhow. Nosein Lifgam is also asur. Now, about how to read that Gemara, there's a machlokes Rashi Tosfos. Tosfos says that those words mimis mois ubedil in shemine are part of the words that come after it. It says like this: it's mimis mois ubedil in shemine. That means is that the Torah asks them, even though they're disgusting. The implication of that is that we would have logically thought that if it's disgusting, it should that they would be mutter. Because it's like the most thing like a chiddush. Even though they're disgusting, even so, the Torah asks them anyhow. As if to say, the implication is if they wouldn't, although if not for this special, possibly telling you that these bugs are asur inherently to eat the bug itself, we would assume they're mutter. So that's a makar to say, like the Rashba, that things that are disgusting are assumed to have bad taste. They don't asur anything else, and it's only the thing itself that's asur. The Torah asur it, but otherwise it wouldn't be asur. That's how Tosfos learns, and that's how the Rashba is reading the Gemara. But Rashi learns the Gemara differently. He learns that the word mimis mois are part of the Gemara's first statement, which is to say like this: chidushu. The Gemara says it's a chidushu to have mimis mois ubedil in shemine, and Rashi says is that since bugs are disgusting and nobody would eat them, then there's no reason for the Torah to ask them. Why would the Torah bother asking so that no one's going to eat anyhow? What's the point? No one's going to eat anyhow. So, if so, those words mimis mois don't prove anything about whether Nosein Lifgam should be more to us. It has nothing to do with that. It's a matter of saying is like, why would the Torah ask for something that no one's going to eat anyhow? Or why would he bother saying that? It has no relevance to us. And that's how the Shach would really want. Anyhow, so we have this machlokes. the Mechaber going according to the Rashba, and the Shach going according to many others. It seems like the consensus of the place comes to follow the Rambam. I mean, those who are Mekel is the Taz and the Chaz Yaakov and the Pri Chadash, the Pri Megadim, the Chachmas Adam, the Aruch HaShulchan. There's a lot of people who are Mekel. The Pasha says that the accepted din is to be Mekel, that Nosein Lifgam, if it's Mimis Mois Abdil Inshabinei, it's Mutter. Now, everything that I told you about that Mimis Mois Abdil Inshabinei, that's when we're trying to decide if something is Nosein Lifgam. Meaning, the thing is Asr, it's inherently Asr. The question is the Nosein Lifgam to something else? But if we want to decide if something is Nifsal Me'achila, meaning maybe it itself should be Mutter, not whether it's Asr something else, if it itself should become Mutter, it should be so disgusted that it's Mutter, then that depends completely on taste. That does not depend on Mimis Mois. And the reason to say that is because like this. The Gemara in Kashrus says, talks about whether urine from different animals is nifsal me'achila and becomes mutter. Okay, meruglayim of different animals, is it nifsal me'achila and mutter, or is it not nifsal me'achila? Now, obviously, urine is moist and nafshesh on kutzim. Nobody wants to eat them, of course not. So the Rashba says that makes something means that it's not considered also. So why should urine be even a shaila? And it's even stronger when you look at the Chazon Ish, who's talking about that Gemara, and he says you want to say that he uses the words the way he says even if it's nafshesh adam katzabehem, that those are familiar from our words from our Gemara that we're talking about. He says the only way to decide if the urine is nifsal mechila or not nifsal mechila is to give someone to taste it who does not know that it's urine, because if he did, he'll automatically his mind will tell him that it's disgusting. So you have to give it to someone who doesn't know, who thinks it's just a random drink, and then tell him to drink it. So here's the Chazon Ish using the words of our Gemara, nafshesh shalom katzmihem, and he says that's not what you use. You don't follow that rule. So is that against the Rashba, against this other Gemara? What's pshat? So the obvious answer is there's a difference between Nosein Lifgam, that's our din, and that's what the Rashba, and nifsal me'achila, which is that Gemara over there. To be Nosein Lifgam, it just has to be that the Isser has a negative effect on the heter. So that could be something physical, like it has a bad taste, or it could be something emotional, like I'm disgusted by it. It echoes me to think that I would eat that food. So whichever one it is, if the effect is negative, then the food is mutter. It doesn't make the food usher. That's linyan Nosein Lifgam. But if you want to say nifsal me'achila, that's not a subjective decision. Is it have a positive effect or not effect? It's when it becomes, if it's edible or it's not edible. I mean, even the Chazon Ish himself says that if something is passably edible, that's considered royal achila. So to be nifsal me'achila, it has to be really not edible. And so nifsal me'achila is different than Nosein Lifgam. Okay, so now let's move to something else. In the past couple of years, people, particularly in Europe, have started adding crickets and other insects like lesser mealworms and migratory locusts into food as a way to add protein to them. Now, crickets are obviously not kosher, and you would think that since we make, let's say, Nosein Lifgam from things that are nafshesh shalom katzmihem, should mean is that as long as there's less than 50% crickets in a food, which is likely, it should be okay, because in Nosein Lifgam, crickets, nobody wants to eat crickets. Nosein Lifgam, so as long as less than 50% of the food, it would be mutter. I mean, of course, but you're not supposed to do that. But if it was if you have a food like that, the idea would be that it should be mutter. But there's a few reasons why that's not correct. The first is we could come at it from we'll call it a halachic type angle. Excuse me, halachic type angle, which is we spoke about some time ago that the Ran says that when the food is Nosein Lifgam, but the person who the person gains more from some positive effect that this food has, more than he loses from the negative taste, then over there it's called higdim midasai. In that case, it gives more bulk to the food, but whatever, if there's some kind of benefit, I get some benefit from this Isser being here, even though taste-wise it's negative. The Ran says that's not mutter, that's not Nosein Lifgam. Nosein Lifgam means it has to be that overall, the putting this food into here has a negative effect. So, obviously over here, the people putting the cricket powder in think that the benefit they get from it, the protein or whatever, that's the reason why they're putting it in, outweighs the negative taste or the fact that people don't want to eat it. Obviously, or else they wouldn't put it in. Why are they putting it in? Obviously, they think that the benefit outweighs the loss. So it's, we can't say it's Nosein Lifgam when we were supposed to be machmir for the Ran, who says that if the benefit outweighs the loss, that's not considered Nosein Lifgam. Here is a good example of that. We also spoke once about homeopathic remedies also use these disgusting things. So again, if the benefit outweighs the loss, then we don't see Nosein Lifgam. And that's like from a halachic type angle. But the truth is, it brings us to a more basic reason why the cricket powder is not going to be mutter. And that is like this. All the cases the poskim speak about when they speak about Nosein Lifgam from these insects and things like that is where the insect or the rodent accidentally fell into the food. So you could say that since people are disgusted by insects, the Isser is Nosein Lifgam, therefore it could be Bitul. But that's all when it happens by mistake. We could argue whether it's Nosein Lifgam or not. But in the case of cricket powder, they're purposely putting it in. It's this really strange case. They're purposely putting in something disgusting into their food. So obviously, and they're putting it in a way that you could taste it. It's not even like carmine that we spoke about once in the past, where it's put in tiny amounts that you don't taste it. So there we had our own questions about whether it's mutter or asur, whether it's Bitul, etc. Over here, they're putting it in amounts that are not Bitul b'shish. I mean, they give taste. So how can you say that it's mutter because Nosein Lifgam when someone put it on purpose? Obviously, he doesn't think it's Nosein Lifgam. Okay, so that's sort of a continuation of what the Ran come from a halachic angle. The benefit of the protein outweighs the loss of the bad taste. But I'm saying here, even from the taste side of it, obviously the person doesn't think the taste is so disgusting or else he wouldn't put it in. Okay, and the truth is, if we probe even deeper, we could find a makar to this, that it's not Nosein Lifgam, and that is because crickets and grasshoppers have an awful lot of similarities. I mean, there's I'll tell you some minor differences between them. Crickets tend to be brown and grasshoppers tend to be green. Crickets tend to be 2 inches long and grasshoppers are 4 inches long. Some crickets have longer antennas than the other ones, but relatively they're very similar to each other. And the Torah actually says you're allowed to eat grasshoppers. There are kosher grasshoppers. Okay, now we're not used to eating grasshoppers, but in other cultures, and even Sephardim to this day who have a Masorah, which grasshoppers eat them, consider them to be a delicacy. So here we are sitting in America saying, "Oh my gosh, crickets are disgusting." Nafshesh Adam, the mimis mois, and people are bedilimine. I don't know if that's true. We're culturally not used to eating them, but as people get more used to it, or in places where they are used to it, then we don't have to say that they're Nosein Lifgam. So all these things, really these three things that I said, sort of go together. That we're making this assumption. We say, well, if ants and mosquitoes are disgusting, then crickets are also. And it doesn't seem like that. And therefore, the truth is that they say that these crickets have a pleasant, nutty taste and all kinds of things like that. I have no idea. I never tried it, of course. But so the idea to say that the mutter because Nosein Lifgam is not gonna fly. Okay, now we move on to a Beryah. So, as an introduction, one of the common issues that we have with insects is when they're finding fresh vegetables and some fruits and things like that. Also, in most cases, the amount of insects that are in there is so little that it would be Bitul b'shishim, of course. So why are they not Bitul? Why is the food not Bitul because it's Bitul? One is because it might not be considered taruvis, because it's possible to remove them. You could look for them or wash them and get them out. That's one reason. And the other is that if they're whole, then they're considered berries, and a berry can't be Bitul. Now, we spoke about this in the past. Okay, that's not for today. But today I'm going to talk about the Beryah angle of it from a different way of looking at it. Okay, and whether Nosein Lifgam plays a role in the Beryah part of it. So like this. We said once before, some time ago, that the Ramah says, the Ramah in Siman Kuf Gimel, that the idea of when we think about tam, whether something is Nosein tam or not, is only relevant to regular isurim that become mutter. They follow the rules of Bitul b'shishim. So then, if it's Nosein Lifgam, so it can be Bitul even without shishim. It means tam is what counts. If it gives tam into the food, it makes the food asur. If it would be Bitul b'shishim, it would not give tam, so it would be mutter. And if it's Nosein Lifgam, then even without shishim, it's mutter also. So tam, in cases where tam plays a role, as indicated by the fact that Bitul b'shishim makes it mutter, then Nosein Lifgam is the reason why it should be Bitul. Now, but the Rambam says, what happens if you have cases where it can be Bitul even without tam, like a Beryah, even if it's Bitul b'shishim, it's still going to make the food asur for some other reason. So obviously, in those cases, tam makes no difference. Tam is not what plays a role in deciding that this food is asur, because even if it's not Nosein tam, it's asur. Therefore, the Rambam says, in that case, it's the food is also even if it's Nes Tam Lifgam. Nes Tam Lifgam is not a heter for those kind of cases because Tam doesn't play a role. So negative Tam doesn't play a role. Now, but the Ramah adds a caveat to that chumrah. Again, it's a chumrah to say that where Tam doesn't play a role, let's say for a Beryah, things like that, then this is a chumrah to say then Nes Tam Lifgam is not a heter. That's a chumrah. So the Ramah says, but if that's only talking about when the Isser is edible, but it's Nosein Tam Lifgam. What happens if the Isser is inherently disgusting? His words are Pegumim Ba'atzman, then the Chumrah doesn't apply. Okay? So this words that he's using, Pegumim, sorry about that. These words that he's using, Pegumim Ba'atzman, is a little bit vague. What does that mean? Well, it means obviously if it's inherently pogum, and not just giving a negative, it means something along the lines of if it's something inherently pogum, and it's not just that it's giving a tam lifgam. Okay, but how much pogum does it have to be? And what's the difference if it's pogum ba'atzmai or if it's nes tam lifgam? What's the difference between these cases? Why is in one case do we say nes tam lifgam is a heter, in one case we don't? So the Achronim have different ways of explaining the Rama over here. So some of the Achronim, like Chavos Das and Pim Gadim, say that the Rama is talking about a Beryah that became a little bit pogum, but it's still edible. So what's the difference? The difference is that when the food is no longer in its pristine form, it's not the way it's supposed to be, it's already starting to degrade, then it's not so prominent anymore. If it's not so prominent, then the heter of the rule of Beryah doesn't play a role. It's not so Beryah means something on a prominence to it if it can't be Bitul. So once it starts breaking down and starts becoming a little less, more disgusting than it was, started to become disgusting, then it can be Bitul. So then, then it becomes, so to speak, like a regular food, and then the time plays a role. Now, some people say that's only true for this cool to say if it's a minimal pagan that it's mutter does not apply if we have foods in isurim that are inherently not positive, like flies and mosquitoes. They're inherently not desirable even when they're whole and when they're berries. So these want to say, the Quran says that they stay berries even if they start becoming inedible, because spoiling a little bit doesn't make them any less prominent than they were beforehand. Beforehand they were prominent even though they were disgusting. So the mosquito becoming a little more disgusting is not going to make a difference. And others, like the Chavos Das, says, no, we only treat them as a Beryah when they're in their natural state. Once they start to degrade a little bit, then we could knock them off their Beryah status and say, like any other Beryah, and say now it's not so prominent anymore, and therefore it could be Baba. Now, Tzil Tzaddik on this Ramah says, he's even beyond these two shittas. He says like this. He says that if the Beryah is Pagam Ba'atzmoi, he doesn't say it becomes Pagam Ba'atzmoi, if they are Pagam Ba'atzmoi. And he says, he wants to say that means is any Beryah that has an off taste, even if nothing changed about it, it was bad, that already would be a heter of the Sam of Gam, that would already allow us to say this is not so prominent, and therefore it's not Sam of Gam, and it's not considered a Beryah anymore. And basically, it includes all insects, because as we've seen, all insects qualify for that. So according to the Tzil Tzaddik, it's going way beyond these to say, even if you start with something that's inherently, if you start with an isser, like a bug, that's inherently has a bad taste to it, and then even doesn't change one bit, that's already enough to mutter. Again, the others that I said beforehand were arguing about what happens if you have a bug and it starts to degrade past what it was originally. Tzil Tzaddik is saying that even if it never degraded, but it started off disgusting, that's already enough reason to say that it's not considered Beryah. Most disagree with this Tzil Tzaddik, and the Gra says that he brings a raya. He says one of the cases that the Shulchan Aruch says about a Beryah which can't be Bitul, he's saying what is his examples of a Beryah that can't be Bitul is taloyim. Okay, so taloyim means that insects, worms. Those are worms that they qualify for this being inherently disgusting, and he says they're considered Beryahs. Why doesn't he say, according to Tzil Tzaddik, you say no, don't have this rule of Beryah because they're disgusting? Obviously, because when you are when you're usher, you have to degrade somewhat, more or less. We could talk about, but you have to degrade a certain amount before you could get off the hook and say now you're no longer a Beryah, and that you're not a Beryah, and next time of Khan could therefore be a heter. Now, I'll mention that the Aruch Shulchan, we spoke about this in Hilchos Tzalayim, uses this heter, essentially what the Tzvi Tzaddik says, as one of his limudei schos. He has three, but his one of limudei schos is why people don't get rid of insects before they eat produce. He says the insects are disgusting, and therefore they don't have a stat of a barrier. Because, along the lines of what the Tzvi Tzaddik is saying is, they don't have the status of barrier because they're disgusting, they're pegum b'atzman, and therefore qualify for the Ramah that says that in that case there's no problem. They're not considered barriers, and they can be buckled based on being their time of kam. Now, in this issue that I'm talking about over here, there's something interesting in this din about that barriers that are pegum b'atzman or mutter really comes from Isav Heter. And if we look how the Teres Chattas brings it, there's different, that's the Ramah, different mashmois in him, how the Teres Chattas brings this Isav Heter, which way he means. Because he says, the Isav Heter says, Beryah shlema musrachas kigoin nemola. So it sounds like that you have a Beryah shlema musrachas, you have and he said, like a nemola, you have an insect, and it began to become disgusted. Didn't completely become inedible. It began to become. So that sounds like the machmir to say is that insects. Okay, now, but the Teres Chattas, when he brings the isvet, he says like this. He says, "Dafil Beryah, imhem begum ba'atzim heim b'teilon shapir the me'achasher iser pogum bato chashivusay." The way he says this word pugum ba'atzman, which is what the Ramah's word, the same word he said, sounds like, and his explanation is the me'achash is a pugum bata chashivusoi seems to maybe include insects even in their natural disgusting state. I'll just point out, the Prim Gadol points out, that there's an extra bracketed line in here, and which says is pirish shenisruchu v'nifgamu achar moisam koidim shenizaravu. That sounds like he means to be makel only if they actually rotted. And the Prim Gadol says, you should know, those words don't appear in Teres Chattas that was printed when the Ramah was alive. The Ramah died in 1572, and by then it was not in the Teres Chattas. About 50 years later, in 1628, the second edition of the Teres Chattas was printed by someone, Rab Pesachia, and he added his comment in, so we shouldn't read too much into that bracketed comment. Okay. Anyhow, so one last thing is that Bitul says is the Ramah. He said he's way more machmir than these that we've seen until now. He says when the Ramah says it's pugum ba'atz, what he means is they became completely inedible. And at that point, of course, if something became completely inedible, then it makes sense that they can't ask for some other food. The thing itself is mutter. It can't ask for another food. And Aruch Shulchan says, listen, I could get it if you tell me like this, that if it's completely inedible, then it doesn't affect the other food. Also, he says, I can understand, you would say, is that because bugs are inherently repulsive, that's a reason why they can't be considered barriers ever. They cannot be considered barriers. The Aruch Shulchan says, I don't really get the logic of the in-between shittas that I mentioned before, which seems to be most people, which is the bug has to start to degrade a certain amount. He says, like, what's the difference? Disgusting, a little more, a little less shouldn't make a difference. Anyhow, those are different shittas about this, about whether bugs should be considered barriers or not be considered barriers, and how much they have to degrade before they become mutter and able to qualify for Nosein.